Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at A Nation Divided in our continuing study of the history of Christianity. The nation of the United States had been formed against the background of slavery. It was part of their government, it was part of their Constitution. The Constitution of the United States had what was called the Three-Fifths Clause. That is, that for the purposes of determining representatives, that slaves were considered three-fifths of a person as they were counted. That doesn't mean they had the right to enjoy that representation. They didn't have a right to vote, but they did count as part of this, but not as a complete person. There was a clause forbidding the government from stopping the importation of slaves before 1801. It was assumed that perhaps someday in the future the government might get involved, but at least that would be prevented for a number of years. There was in clause 4.2 the fugitive slave clause that said if a slave escapes from the South and makes it to a place where to a state that is not recognizing slavery, because there were states that did not allow slavery. They were in the North. That those northern states would be required to capture that slave, to recapture that slave, and to send that slave back to the owner of what was considered that property. Now, most presidents, from George Washington all the way down to Abraham Lincoln, who was the 16th president of the United States, most of them owned slaves. Slavery was just a way of life among them. Absalom Jones was born as a slave, and yet he learned how to read and write. Most slaves, in fact, we're going to see there was a law forbidding the teaching of slaves, or there were laws like that in the states, not in the national government. But he was born a slave, learned to read and write, and he eventually purchased freedom for his wife and children, and then after that was freed himself. Yeah, if you were allowed to by your master, you could collect the funds, you could purchase the freedom of both another or even yourself. And he became a lay minister in the Methodist Church. The Methodist Church, remember, had broken away from the Church of England back in the 1700s, and that was his time. And black members were not permitted on the first floor of the church. So when they came into the church, they couldn't worship with everybody else there. They had to go in the balcony. You've seen perhaps churches, large churches that would have a balcony. And so that was the place, sort of the back of the church. That was the place where the blacks, Christian blacks, who were allowed to come to church. Not everybody was, but they could only go up there. They were not allowed into the general congregation. And he saw that as a bit of a travesty compared to what you see in Christianity. Think of the Epistle of James, where James writes and says, it's not fitting if well, people come into your church. Actually, he used the word synagogue there, but and some are told, here you can sit up front, and others are told, where here sit in this other place. And so he was ordained eventually by the Episcopal Church. Now, the Episcopal Church was the Church of England, but then after the War for Independence, they weren't going to have the Anglican Church anymore in the United States. That just wouldn't be popular. And so instead, they referred to that as the Episcopal Church. It broke off, but it still looked like the Anglican Church, except without England. And he was ordained by the Episcopal Church when a yellow fever epidemic came to Philadelphia, and people were just dying, a very high casualty rate. A great many people just up and left town. But he stayed along with a number of the blacks, free blacks, and they led mercy ministry efforts, which sort of put to shame the way they had been treated, but also the way they served. They actually did a wonderful job of serving those in need and showing the love of Christ in a situation like that. He eventually founded the African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas. St. Thomas is one of the Virgin Islands. This was in 1794. And you will see a great many African Episcopal churches. You'll see a great many black churches in the South. And a great many of them look to him as their originator. He petitioned Congress against the Fugitive Slave Act, that act that said, if a slave escapes to the north, then then you have to capture him and send him back to his owner in the south, even though in the north slavery is illegal. Um, well, it was illegal to free slaves without a court order. And so if you didn't, if you just had a master said, I'm going to set you free, if it didn't go through the courts and the court allowed it, and there was a charge, can I say there was a penalty involved, a financial penalty, not just the loss of the ownership of the slave, but you actually had to pay the government um, in order to free a slave. This Fugitive Slave Act was misused oftentimes to kidnap free blacks and to put them back into slavery, saying, well, they were just escaped, they're not really free. They actually had a movie not too long ago, 12 Years a Slave, where that sort of thing was shown to be taking place. That was a real thing that was happening back then. The Slave Bible was published in 1807. Now, by this time, there were those that were beginning to be able to read. Notice it was published in the British West India Islands, so it wasn't published in the United States. But this Bible became, it was smuggled into the United States, and it was a reaction to the Haitian Revolution in 1803, which had, broken away from France, but also had in many ways turned its back on Christianity. Not everybody in Haiti did, but a reaction to that now. And this Bible, if I can call it that, was carefully edited. It omitted the book of Exodus, at least the Exodus from Egypt. It had other parts of Exodus in there, but the slaves, the Israelite slaves leaving Egypt, how Paul says we are all one in Christ, whether bond or free. That actually was just cut out. The entire book of Revelation was cut out of this slave Bible, which tells us that it was a reaction not by blacks but by whites who were saying they wanted to use the Bible and to leave in those parts that said slaves be obedient to your masters. Remember, the slavery in the New Testament had a very different face. It had, can I say it this way? It had a very different color, because slavery back in the first century wasn't about black and white. It was about slave and free, and so you could have a white slave that owned a black, or a white master that owned a black slave, or a black slave, a black master that owned a white slave. You could the first century wasn't nearly so culture conscious, or so color conscious, I should say, as you had in the United States, which was the polar opposite. By 1854, you had both, notice, the United States in the east, but you had territories in the west. And the big issue was whether they were going to be free states or territories, or whether they were going to be slave states or territories. And it had largely come down to places in the north versus in the south. Notice the slave states were in the south, from Texas all the way over to Maryland and Virginia. There wasn't an East or West Virginia yet, but there would be. That's going to be a division that's caused by the American Civil War. Dred Scott was another slave, had been born as a slave, and then taken to the free state of Illinois. Um, but he was still a slave, and so when his master died, his widow inherited him. So not only is he living in a slave state, but he's living in a slave state without a master. Well, he has a new master, or mistress, is the master's widow, and so he files a lawsuit, a legal lawsuit, for his freedom. Now he was quite educated. Actually, he was quite eloquent, and it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court issues a ruling that no African American can be a citizen. Probably the worst ruling. They've made some bad ones, let me just say. So, but a terrible ruling from the Supreme Court against, not just against slaves, but against any sort of person of color. And now he was eventually sold to the widow's. I think it was the widow's brother. Somehow came under, and that widow's brother. By now, this case had since it had made it up to the Supreme Court, it had gained national attention, and so the brother just set him free. He was manumitted. Manumitted means it's an old Latin phrase, means he was set free. This bill from that era, notice, caution colored people of Boston. Boston was up in Massachusetts, a free state. One and all, you are hereby respectfully cautioned and advised to avoid conversing with watchmen and police officers of Boston. I mean, be afraid of police officers, it's saying. For since the recent order of the mayor and aldermen, they are empowered to act as kidnappers and slave catchers, and they've already been actually employed in kidnapping, catching, and keeping slaves. Therefore, if you value your liberty and the welfare of the fugitives among you, shun them in every possible manner, as so many hounds on the track of the most unfortunate of your race. And notice this is dated 1851. Now, Fred Douglas was born as a slave. He learned to read, and he taught other slaves to read the New Testament. And so a very educated man, had a high way of speaking, escaped to the North, and became a eloquent spokesman for abolition. In fact, so eloquent that there were times where other abolitionists came to him and said, "Well, could you talk a little bit more like a slave? Because people aren't really connecting you with the slaves that they see that are uneducated." And he said, no, no, actually, they need to see that a black man can be educated, that a black man can be eloquent, that he can speak, fine English, probably finer English than a lot of whites were speaking. And he started a newspaper called the North Star. Now, why was it called the North Star? Because when a slave in the South would escape, they weren't necessarily, he couldn't pick up his cell phone or even a map necessarily to find out which way to go. But one thing he could do, if he could see the sky at night, if you could figure out which star was the North Star, that was always pointed north, and that could take you from the southern states and just follow the North Star, and you could follow it all the way across the border of the southern states and into the northern states. And sometimes you had to keep going all the way to Canada. We're going to see that actually becomes a story, a published story, to have that Canadian emphasis, which did not have that law where you had to return escaped slaves. Here's a picture of an African camp meeting. Remember how we had seen in the Second Great Awakening the use of camp meetings? Well, blacks had theirs as well. They copied. They're probably a lot poorer and a lot closer to home, but still they copied that same some of the same things that we saw in the Second Great Awakening. It caught on among them too. So Christianity eventually did catch among the black slaves. They would often preach about have sermons about the book of Exodus, which had been removed from the slaves' Bible, but they captured pieces of it. Another book that came out around this time was named Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Remember, we saw that she had a father and grandfather that were Christian abolitionists, and she actually tells two stories. The first story is the story of Tom. So the book is in two parts. You can almost think of it in a sense, I don't want to stretch this too far, but maybe as an Old Testament and a New Testament story. But the first story is the story of Tom, who's a slave, and he becomes a Christian. Initially, he is owned by some kind masters, and they tell him about Christ. He becomes a Christian, but then he is sold. They come on to financial hard times, and he is sold down the river, literally down the river, down the Mississippi River, to Simon Legree, who is an evil and a very harsh taskmaster. And eventually, he is beaten to death. That's the sort of the climactic part of that portion of the book. And as he's beaten, Simon isn't doing the beating himself. He's actually having two other slaves ordering them to beat Tom. And as he is being beaten to death, he's telling them about Jesus. And so he's dying a terrible death, a painful death, telling them about someone who died for their sins. And at the end of that section, one of those who had been involved in beating him to death goes to him as he is dying there and says, "Can you tell me about this person, Jesus? Can you tell me more?" And actually a beautiful story of one who is giving his life. His life is being taken from him. And then you have the story of Eliza, and I don't remember if there was any kind of relationship, but also a slave who is going to try to escape, and she makes it to the Ohio River. Now, the imagery here you have to catch is a little bit like the Israelites crossing the Red Sea, but the river's not going to divide, but it's wintertime and the river's frozen over. And so she begins to cross, but then the river's breaking up and she's having to jump from ice floe to ice floe as she crosses the Ohio River. Um, and it's an exciting story. Um, she eventually meets her mother, makes it not just to the north, but over the Ohio River, but eventually makes it up to Canada. And then from there, at the end of the book, she travels to Liberia. She travels to Liberia is a place in Africa that had been resettled, and you'd had slaves that had become free in the United States, and they'd gone back to Africa, to Liberia, and they had resettled there to make that a country of free people who had returned from the United States. And she does that, and the picture is she's finally made it to the promised land. The American Civil War, when it breaks out in 1861, in fact, Harriet Beecher Stowe at one point met Abraham Lincoln, and he looked at her and he said, "So you're the little lady that started this entire war," and that's perhaps a bit of an overstatement, but certainly that was an issue. Now, sometimes you'll talk to people that say the issue of the war was state rights. Well, that's true, but it was specifically the right to own slaves. That's what it was all about. If slavery had not been an issue, there would not have been an American Civil War. That's very clear. Um, and leading up to that, there had been the big issue had been what about those other states, those territories that are becoming states? Will they be a slave state or will they be a free state? And the South did not want other states to become free states. That was, they didn't want other states to have state rights. They only wanted their right to own slaves. That was really their main issue in the war. There were denominations that split over this issue of slavery. We'll look at some of those Presbyterians and Methodists and Baptists that split on this issue, and in some cases remain split even to this day. The Southern churches defended slavery as being biblical. They said, well, slavery's in the Bible, and by the way, it is. I think the nature of that slavery and the racial consciousness is very different from what you have in the Bible versus what you had in the United States at this time. But slavery is in the Bible. Um, a Baptist pastor, Ebenezer Warren, this is a quote from him: "Both Christianity and slavery are from heaven. Both are blessings to humanity. Both are to be perpetuated to the end of time." He was a Southern preacher that was trying to, and Baptist preacher that was trying to justify the sort of slavery that the United States was seeing in his day. There were laws initially against slave literacy. We saw that sometimes there were workarounds for those, but there were laws in some states. There was no national law, but there were state laws that made it illegal to teach a slave to read and write, believing that if we can just keep them mentally subjugated, then we'll be able to keep them physically subjugated. Notice here another pamphlet, Southern Slaves and the Bible, a Scriptural Refutation, principal arguments upon which the abolitionists rely. So this is a pamphlet against the abolitionists, against the setting free of slaves. There were laws against manumission that made, remember, manumission is to set a slave free, that made it very difficult. Indeed, there were a few cases where there were some free blacks living in the South that made it practice to own slaves. And I've actually had people say, well, see, there were blacks that owned slaves. Yes, but they owned slaves for a very particular purpose because of these laws against manumission. What they would do is they'd say, okay, we're going to purchase this person. Here's your papers. You belong to me. Now, don't tell anybody, but you can go do what you want. You're technically free, but not legally free. I'm going to keep your papers so that if anybody asks, no, you're not an escaped slave. You're doing what I told you to do. We'll call it working for me. But if you want to get married and have a house and have children, you're not going to be sold or anything like that. This is a workaround, and there were blacks that did that workaround. Um, um, as because of these laws against manumission. Um, so Christian blacks would oftentimes have a redemption theme in their preaching, both the Exodus story, but also Jesus who came to redeem us and to set us free. And I think now much later, I think of Dr. Martin Luther King, who would use a great many of those Old Testament passages in a mighty way and in a proper way that was appropriate to talk about the freedom that we have in Christ. The Red Sea, as we pictured, became a way of looking at the Ohio River, which was that border between the southern states and the northern states. And if we could just make it past that body of water, we would go to the promised land. That imagery was often used in sermons, and we saw it used by Harriet Beecher Stowe in her Uncle Tom's Cabin. As the war broke out, there was every expectation on both sides that it would be a very short war. It's going to end up 600,000 casualties, more casualties than perhaps I think any other conflict that the United States has been engaged. Um, there were men of faith on both sides. There were people that were Christians. Now, I think that those in the South had a big blind spot. Sometimes I wonder what is our blind spot today, but that's a subject of another conversation. Um, we have ordinances mandating observances on the Sabbath. Now, that doesn't mean they're never going to fight on Sunday or Saturday either, for that matter. But that from usual duties, they were to be, sort of downgraded. And I remember back in my firefighting days, I was a battalion chief, and we had what I, referred to sometimes as the Sunday schedule. A lot of the not things that had to be done. If you had a fire, you were going to go. And you still had to prepare your equipment and things like that. But some of the day-to-day work we would dispense with and have sort of a down day. And this was done in the American Civil War as well. Military chaplains actually became popular. We talked in a previous class about how military chaplains in the War for Independence, in the Revolutionary War, some of them had been maybe at the bottom of the barrel. This wasn't so much the case anymore. So they became popular in both the North and the South. There were tracts distributed. Sometimes if they were distributed in the South, they might have a very specific slave theme to them. And at the end of the war ended in 1865. It had only been over for a short time when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. He was actually assassinated on a Friday. It happened to be the Friday before Easter. It happened to be Good Friday. And people did not miss the significance of the one who had led the sort of the path to redemption, the path to freeing the slaves. He had actually pushed the Emancipation of Proclamation, which at the time had only freed those slaves in the South that hadn't freed all slaves, but that's where most of the slaves were. Um, but he died. He was assassinated and died on Good Friday. And so, in the eyes of many, he became sort of uh, a a Jesus figure, a redemptive figure, and was spoken of in such a manner. Now, I said that a number of churches a number of denominations, I should say, saw their splitting over this issue. You had the Methodist Episcopal Church that had been formed in 1784. In 1841, the Wesleyan Methodist Church split over the issue of slavery, that they were against slavery. The Methodist Episcopal had tried to not take a stance on that issue. And then 1845, the Methodist Episcopal Church South had wanted to take a stance for slavery. So those splits took place in the Methodist Church. You have among the Baptists, going back to the 1600s, a division between the particular versus the regular Baptists. Remember, that was the issue over predestination and Calvinism. So that you had in 1727 the Free Will Baptists trying to reject those ideas of predestination, at least individual predestination. But the other Baptists did not. But they saw their divisions not necessarily a division of denomination, but a division within the denomination of what was called the old lights versus the new lights. We talked about that in the First Great Awakening. Those that wanted, sort of the traditional way of preaching, and those that were about giving the gospel and evangelizing, the new lights. And then you finally have in the 1800s the primitive Baptists. Now, the primitive Baptist sounds like going back to the roots. Well, they were, but they were going back to their Calvinist roots. So the primitive Baptists were actually Calvinists, 1827. And then the Southern Baptists, the reason it's called Southern Baptists is because they were pro-slavery. That's you have what's called the Southern Baptist Church today. Now, they're no longer pro-slavery today, and they have come out in very recent times and said, we have a sort of a terrible history, and we want to confess, and we shouldn't have had that history, that aspect of it. But they're still called the Southern Baptists today, even as I give this class. The Episcopal Church, you'd had the Protestant Episcopal Church, but then in 1861, with the outbreak of the American Civil War, you have the Protestant Episcopal Church in the Confederate States of America. So the war actually causes that break in the denomination of the Episcopal Church. Remember, the Episcopal Church was the Church of England, but without England, so they didn't call it the Anglican Church anymore. Now they called it the Episcopal Church. The word Episcopal means it's got one person at the top. It's sort of a church with an overseer. Finally, you have the Presbyterian Church. I say finally, this is also 1861, where with the outbreak of the war, there was a break between the Presbyterian Church in the United States of America versus in the South, the Presbyterian Church in the Confederate States. And once the war was over, those two churches in the North and the South did not reunify. In the South, it now became the Presbyterian Church in the United States. You say, well, you have the Presbyterian Church in the United States of America, and then there's just the Presbyterian Church in the United States. Sort of hard to tell them apart, but one's in the North and one's in the South. And then in the 1900s, because that division is going to continue all the way into the 1900s, the Presbyterian Church in the United States of America, the one in the North, you're going to see a breakup, and there will be a breaking off from that church. The Orthodox Presbyterian Church, it's not over slavery, but over the rise of liberalism and the denial of certain key doctrines in the Bible. And so that will take place in the 1930s. And likewise, the Presbyterian Church in the United States, the one in the South, you will see a break off from that in the 1970s, early 1970s, with what's called the Presbyterian Church in America for the same reason, but it just takes longer for that issue to ferment and bring it to a crisis in the South. And then after that takes place, after you've had a breakup of the Northern and then the Southern, eventually in 1983, the Northern and Southern more liberal churches that where you'd had the breakup of the conservative elements, actually I want to say the Bible believing elements, then those two denominations will reform and they will come together and unify. It would be nice if you could say, well, the Orthodox Presbyterian Church and the Presbyterian Church in America, the more conservative groups also reunify. They haven't. They have some agreements. They work together, hopefully very nicely, but they have not reunified, and they have stayed divided. Not over slavery. It doesn't have anything to do over slavery. They're very much alike, and they have the same doctrinal statement, but they're still separate.